I request the audience to please take their seats quickly. I request Professor Aditya Nigam to please come on stage. Audience, please settle down. We have our panelists and the chair on the stage. I request you to settle down quickly.
फ्रेंच कनेडियन है लेकिन ऑक्सफोर्ड में पढ़ा था मैं एग्जाम्पल पलट गया इंग्लिश सर पेंसिल भी चलेगी नहीं है आपके सामने.
A very good afternoon to all of you. I, Utkarsh Senbor, on the behalf of JNU Academic, welcome you all in our last session of this conference, the Roundtable. Let me introduce our chair and panelists of the session one by one. The session will be chaired by Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. He was a professor of political science and director of Developing Countries Research Center at University of Delhi. He is a distinguished professor at the Council for Social Development, New Delhi, where until recently he edited the CSD Sage journal Social Change. His research interests include the comparative politics of the world, economy of China, India, and global transformation. He is an emeritus fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies, its founding member of the former chairperson. He has authored, among others, Caste, Class and Gender, The Political Philosophy of Mao Zedong, Red and Green, 5 Decades of the Maoist Movement in India, Ideology Matters, and so on. We welcome you, sir. We have among our speakers none other than Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. He is a professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies at Columbia University, US. He has done his PhD from Jawaharlal University and has also taught there in Center of Political Studies. Prior to joining Columbia University, he was a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He works on 2 fields of intellectual history, Indian social and political thought in the 19th and 20th century, and modern Indian literature and cultural production. His major publications include The Imaginary Institution of India, Civil Society History and Possibilities, Politics in India, Enchantment of Democracy, and other essays. We are pleased to have you, sir. Next we have Professor Gurpreet Mahajan, who was a professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She was closely associated with the Center for Philosophy and officiated the position of its chairperson in 2004 and 5. Thank you. Should I? Okay, now that's all from my side. Now I would like to hand over the stage to our professor, our chair, Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. Thank you. Oh. We also have with us Professor Aditya Nigam. Professor Aditya Nigam is a former professor at the Center for Study of Developing Societies, Delhi. He is one of the foremost exponents of the decolonizing theory in India. He also works as the CSDS Indian in Languages program and is on the editorial board of its Hindi journal. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. We are pleased to have you on the stage. And, sir, and also, we have Dr. Manindra Thakur. He is an associate professor at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And thank you, sir, for
Friends, this is really a great occasion, especially for me because I was very keen that I should be part of this event, not because it is a political science activity, but because such an activity is taking place at this moment in Indian history. And when I heard a bit of your conference on YouTube yesterday, Manindra saying, JNU has survived, I was really so happy. So democracy in India has survived. I hope we can say with the same confidence. And the lessons from the recent past as well as the present, we have to learn. I think those lessons take us to the theme of this seminar. And since we are dealing with issues of politics, power for what, freedom for whom, liberation, transformation, what kind of transformation, those issues. I think these issues are at the very center of this moment of Indian history. And therefore, this event is very, very important. Each one of you would remember these discussions in whatever pursuits you engage in future. You have had 2 days of excellent, very powerful discussions. I could hear bits and pieces of it on YouTube, from home. I'm not sure if I'll have the energy for sitting here for 2 hours, but I'll try my best. Two things, because this is a roundtable, we are, though because of the number of people present here, you have this format. Otherwise, we will have a roundtable format. Namely, we will have more than one round. I will request each of the speakers to take 10 minutes to speak on their takeaways or their highlights, their reflections on the 2 days of deliberations. And then I will raise some questions. Those questions are very simple. What, according to you, should be the principal focus, a priority area that, according to you, or that would be your priority area in the pursuit of Indian political theory? Second, do you have a cautionary note, a warning, something that you would like everybody to remember, to be very careful about? And third, do you have a methodological suggestion? Whatever methodology or by methodology you understand. So these will be my 3 questions, and we'll give again 5 to 7 minutes. And they can also respond to each other in those 5 to 7 minutes. Then we will have open discussion, namely we will take some very brief comments and questions from the floor, and then we will have again 5 to 7 minutes each from all the 4 panelists. That will be the beginning of the second round. I would only take another 2 minutes to place 2 of my concerns before you. One of my concerns is the language of discourse, the mode of communication. I think you have discussed it in the 2 days very much. The day we take English as just a facilitator of communication and not what Noam Chomsky had always warned us. Language is content. It's not just communication. It's philosophy, it's politics, it has symbols of power and so on. So how to engage in people's discourse, in people's languages. And for that, I think the 2 books which have been discussed and which have really prompted many of these discussions, Gyan Ki Rajniti and Decolonizing Theory, and many other writings of many of you, have warned us about this. But, so that is one. Because then the discourse will be of a different kind. Whether it will be Charcha on Samata, Charcha on Aman. So what is the language of discourse? And whether you can engage in the discourse in people's language with people. And we who have spent time thinking about articulation, modes of communication, and studying various traditions that we carry to that level, to the level of people. In other words, we learn from people to be part of that discourse. Not just the 28 scheduled languages, but 600 plus languages of people in India and globally. This is why I have been very concerned in recent years trying to understand things like Ubuntu, Chefan, Bien Vivir, things like that, Samatha, Swaraj, and so on. This is one, language of discourse. The second is these across traditions. This cross traditions has meant dialogue with the West, response to the West, critique of the West, in creative theory colloquium we always say that even alternative discourse was alternative to the dominant discourse of the West. In other words, the reference point is still the West. Okay? Whereas the creative theory, begins with people's discourse, people's problems, actual conditions, actual historical reality, and so on. Issues. So from India and West, how to really, and you have discussed it, this universalization of discourse. Not even North-South. I'm part of many of us are part of the Bandung network, and we have many philosophers and theorists in that network. Again, the same. South critiquing the North. Third world critiquing the first world, and so on. So how, indeed, we take all parts of the world as participants, as having civilizations, having philosophical traditions. And that will require having a different view of the text. And folklore as text, painting as text, folk practices as text, not just shastras and classics as texts, and so on, even Puranas. In other words, yeah, Shastra to Purana is a good change, but beyond Purana. So really globalizing, universalizing, taking all parts of the globe as constituents of our universe of knowledge, and therefore theorize. So these are my two concerns, and this is what I'm so glad. 87, I wrote the piece, Changing Terms of Discourse, and this generation has reached a wonderful stage of engaging in discourse with confidence. With these, sorry, I took more time than I thought I should. With these words, I now begin the symposium, the roundtable, and we'll go by that order, because the second round will be in reverse. Okay? All right. So the first 10 minutes. That is for Sudipta.
Remind me when I come to it.
Okay.
Okay. I came to this conference primarily not to speak, but essentially to get a sense of what Indian political, thinking about Indian political theory means today, or is like today. And I'm very thankful for that, because I think I've got a very vivid sense of the different strands in which thinking about Indian political theory is going. So I would make my comments brief. When I started teaching in JNU, we also thought that it's important to have a critical perspective about politics, approaches to the political world. But the ingredient using which we wanted to make our thinking critical were very different at that time. And I was particularly influenced by Marxism. Marxism is a very vague term, so you could choose between different strands of Marxism. But there were also other strands of critical thinking. But I'm very struck by the fact that in thinking about Indian political thought today seems to be at a moment where it's on the cusp of something which is very interesting. I do not know what would come out eventually, but I think it perceives itself to be at a moment of historical change. So that's the first thing that I noticed here. But I've also seen this happening gradually through recent writing. I'll mention three. Aditya's book on decolonizing theory, for which I wrote a long review. And the review is so long because I think his questions are absolutely central. And I didn't think that I should write a kind of cursory review of 3 pages and do with it. The second book, which again I read with great care and admire for very different reasons, because the strengths of that book are very different from the strengths of Aditya's book. That is Prathama's book on the elementary aspects of the political. The third book, which goes in a very different direction, is Manindra's book on Gyan Ki Rajniti. But what is common between the 3 of those is that all 3 are actually trying to make this moment in history, which is also a moment of political stress in many ways. But we know from history that these inflection points in history, points of political stress, are also points which are very generative of new ideas. So that is something which struck me very powerfully. So I'm very happy that we are at this particular moment. However, we should not be too complacent. Saying that we should take a new turn is not taking a new turn. I think the important thing is to do work which is not just a reflection of previous work, or work in which, to quote something from your position paper, we should cease to think of ourselves as consumers of Western theory. So let me make a couple of points about Indian thought. In a certain sense, the central question of this conference has been, what is Indian thought? Accidentally, I'm in the process of writing a paper which is called What is Western about Western Thought? And it touches on certain things which came up in Rahul Govind's presentation in the morning, which I liked very much. And I would like to take that argument forward by saying that to think of the universal as opposed to the global as a binary, that either you have that or you have this, I don't think is a very productive way of thinking. It's a range at one end of which you have ideas which are highly universal, at another end you have ideas which are meant to be and rightfully local. And these are not just the two ways in which human beings think. I think what I call the historical is something which is in between, in a certain sense. Not that the local is not historical, but what I mean is that the intermediate level theorization that you get in modern social theory in Marx, Tocqueville, Weber, etc. We need to do more of that kind of thinking about our own society and not give that over to European thinkers who have done that before. So my first point would be that I think there are three ways in which political thought can be Indian. I'll do it telegraphically, but during discussion we can come back to it. I've also done a little bit slight expansion of this in an exchange I had with James Tully. He wrote a very interesting paper. Those of you who are interested in this question ought to read it. It's a long paper. It's a very well thought out paper. But it's also a hard paper to read in a certain sense, partly because of its length. It's called Deep Parochializing Political Theory. And the first move in Jim Tully's paper is to say that in order to deparochialize the activity called political theory, we must understand the parochialism of the body of writing, which we now designate as political theory. To understand the parochialism of that is actually the condition for making the activity of political thought non-parochial. Now, I respect that move. I would leave it to you to look at that. I think there are three ways in which political thought can be Indian. The first way of making political thought Indian would be to take up what Manindra has said, that we take up fundamental concepts. For instance, his move, I think, is a very powerful, bold move. It's, as I said in my remarks, it's still undeveloped in some ways, but I think there is no question about the boldness of the move, because he's essentially saying the basic philosophical position is something I do not, in my own thinking about politics, I do not start with a conception of human nature. I do not think there is a conception of human nature. But if you believe that there is a conception of human nature, then I think what he is saying is really radical. That instead of looking for pictures of human nature that you get in Western thought, you take Indian thought, a very well understood tradition of Indian thought, which thinks of four different aspects of the human personality, Purushartha, and then try to think with that. That's the first way in which political thought can be Indian. If somebody writes a treatise on political theory, making that the basis of his thinking, I think that would be something which is totally underivative of Western thought, and therefore Indian. The second way of making political thought Indian, at the end I would make another remark for just a couple of minutes, is to draw upon not the ancient and medieval tradition of Western thought, which is much more recognizably Indian. For instance, if I say that I draw something from Vaishnava, or when I draw something from the Kashmiri, there is no doubt that I'm actually using a theoretical template, which is Indian. Right? The second way of making political thought Indian is more complex. But there is a second tradition of Indian political thought, unmistakably Indian political thought, underived from the West. It is the tradition of political thought of modern Indian thinkers like Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, even Bankim, Bhudev, etc. I'm not talking about my preferences among these people. But if you say, why is it Indian? I have a complicated theoretical argument I can make, a 2-hour argument about that. But the basic point is very simple. The basic point is that you can look at modernity. Modernity in general is a very big statement in two different ways. Either you see modernity as something which is diffusive, that something happens in the West, extremely powerful, technologically, politically, economically, and it spreads to the rest of the world. When you say it spreads to the rest of the world, folded into that is the idea that what would happen in the rest of the world would be something which would be similar to what has happened before. This is one picture of modernity. I have gradually become deeply critical of that picture, and I see modernity not as diffusionist or diffusive in that sense. I see modernity as contradictory in the sense in which the Hegel-Marx tradition would use it. That contradictory here means that things which cohere because they are structurally united, but they are fundamentally oriented in different directions. They try to pull into different directions, right? But they are held together in one structure. That is why it is contradictory. So that's why capitalism is contradictory. I think modernity is contradictory, which means, how modernity is experienced in the West is not how modernity is experienced in India. And the second tradition of Indian political thought emerges out of that. The third way in which political thought can be Indian, underived from the West, would be if Indian political thought does conceptualization of experiences which are entirely new through the development of capitalism here, or through the development of democracy here, or something like that, which is significantly different from what has happened in the West, and therefore must be different, from what we have got in the Western tradition. Now let me make the other point very quickly. Just two points very quickly. The first is the second type of Indian thought. I said that it's Indian, but it seems to be derived from the West. I think I have a slight disagreement with both Viku Parikh. I probably have more disagreement with Viku Parikh, less with Partha Chatterjee, in their judgment that Indian political thought is derivative. I don't think this body of modern Indian thought is derivative, but there is a deep problem about that, which is something that we should learn to see. I think I have actually learned to see this only very recently. The very peculiar feature of this kind of modern political thought in India is that it tries to break away from the West, right? But it does that trying to break away from the West in a language which is derived from Western political thought, the language of Western modernity. So if you look at the Indian Constitution, it tries to develop a form of the state which I think is profoundly different from the form of the nation state that is paradigmatic in the West. But it does so, even the trying to be different is in the language, in the same language. And so therefore I think one of the most important things to see our political thought as innovative and not derivative is to try to break through the language, because the language betrays the purpose in a certain sense. So finally, one last point, it's a very general point about political theory, because we are, I suppose, predominantly students of political thought or students of political theory. I think there's a radical difference between the way political thought is thought by the thinkers and then offered to the world. Let me put it slightly more frivolously. When we think about any kind of thinking, it's simple and it seems very convincing to say that there's a making side, the making of theory, and the taking of theory. That somebody writes the theory and somebody reads the theory. I'm the reader, and Marx is the writer, Hegel is the writer. I don't think that's actually a good way of looking at what happens in the reading of political theory. I'll make a distinction gradually, driven by my experience as a teacher of political thought, a student of political thought, that making and taking is an inadequate conception. Reading political theory and using political theory are different things. Reading political theory in order to pass an exam is, in a certain sense, you could say, simple reading. But reading political theory to live in our world, reading Marx to understand Indian capitalism, reading Hegel to understand the modern state, etc., right, cannot actually remain that kind of passive reading because of my encounter with the reality of this state, which is very different from the Hegel state. My encounter with the reality of Indian capitalism, very different from Marx's capitalism. Marx's own arguments, Marx's own concepts actually change, not in his hand, but change in my hand. I have to be perceptive about this. I have to see how the concept changes when I'm using it. And I think this is something that we ought to do more deliberately, with greater consciousness. And I think the more we do this, I think our political thinking will become more Indian. And we would cease to be, not at one go, because it's not something that can be, we cannot abolish the result of colonialism of 200 years by taking a decision just one evening. But I think as we go along, our political thought would actually become more recognizably Indian, and we would cease to be less and less of consumers of Western political theory.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Last point was the most important.
I wanted to give you an example. I might have given this example before in CSDS or somewhere. I think when I think of the use of political theory, I think we do what children do, with Legos. If you present a Lego to a child, the first time the child would actually put the Lego together according to the instructions. The second time, the child would not put it according to the instructions. He would break it apart and he would do it in a way which is his own, which would start deviating from the instructions. So that's what we should do to the Lego of political thought.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Now we turn to Gurpreet Mahajan.
Thank you very much. I may not get another chance to say, but thank you for the invitation to be here and share my thoughts. And so I thought before I say anything, and Professor Mohanty has delineated the task for us, that it has to be divided into various components, and I'll try my best to put on hold any comment about what I think Indian political theory could and possibly do and should look like. But first, a general statement about the title, The Future of Indian Political Theory, and I see so much enthusiasm for debate and discussion. And when I heard the questions, particularly all coming from very deep critical reflection and engagement, I thought the quick answer can be the future of Indian political theory is in good, solid hands, upward trajectory, and I need to say no more. So no more assurance is really needed, because what is theory other than really thinking about, reflecting on the world we live in, what are the ways in which we make sense of it, and how should we really proceed with that. So I think I needed that assurance, and I got it by coming here. So thank you very much for that. In the first 10 minutes that the chair is giving us, and I must also thank you for bringing us together, I mean all the scholars, and I've met Professor Mohanty for so long, so it's so nice to see everybody here. I think in the first 10 minutes, I thought I might just share what used to happen on this question, the debate that happened around this question long before many of you were born. Because that's when it goes back to. This was a moment of heated discussion, intense discussion, often in Sudipta's room, about what should be the nature of Indian political theory, but even more so, what should we, if we believe we are doing political theory generally, what should we be doing? And we assume we are Indian, so what should we be doing? This was a question that we went over and over again with. And I thought I would go back to this past because in the course of debate that occurred over at least next 15 years, if not more, we came to realize some things, and we thought maybe now our starting point about thinking on this subject should go from there. But we also realized that ideas are never fully settled. We think we have arrived at a certain understanding, but those ideas, those settlements get unsettled, and those ideas come back into circulation, and therefore it is necessary, in that sense past is never past, so it's necessary to revisit those, because that's also a shorthand way of saying, what are the things that we could be looking at, and what is it that we did think about when this question came up. So it's a kind of discursive field within which this issue has been raised. Long before we started asking this question, at least I started asking this question in the 80s, there was already a sentiment that we don't have a parallel tradition of political thought. It's easy to talk about Western political thought, but we haven't constructed a parallel tradition, let's say, of Indian political thought. And we did have people like V.R. Mehta who took that job seriously and wrote about that particular aspect. But this question about the Indian political thought and Indian political theory gained a new dimension, I think from late 70s and well into the 80s, and I think brought back into circulation by some of the initial chapters in Manindra's book, is the fact that there is something which yesterday Sudipta referred to as a cognitive lag. That there is, as it were, a hiatus between what the social scientists do and the world we inhabit, the people that we are really talking about, or the society we are talking about. There is this conceptual lag. Part of the reasoning was that social scientists are using concepts and categories which are in that sense borrowed from the West, or they are Western categories, and they don't really speak to the people. Sometimes they call them masses, but to the people in a positive sense. So this was the thing about decolonizing and so on and so forth, etc. And this became this became a focus of attention, and I think in the course of the debate I learned three things which I want to keep in mind all the time. The first is that every time we made these sharp boundaries, Indian, Western, this move itself was something which ossified both ends. It created, as it were, a false homogeneity, and it was inevitably essentializing. No matter how many times we said we are not essentializing, but it inevitably does this, because you have to reduce it. Then you say, but it's inevitable, I have to reduce it to a core. Yes, there is a dominant moment. We must also talk about other non-dominant ideas that exist at that time, which might become dominant subsequently. So that's the first move I learned, that when we are thinking about Indian political theory, one needs to be very careful, because this is this great danger of being involuntarily, without our wanting to be there, really being fitted and thinking in terms of these modes, these monadic elements which are essentializing. Obviously this also meant, and this is to say, even though we may say that it is self, we needed to talk about Indian traditions of political theory and Western traditions in the plural, and they can be have multiple locations, textual and non-textual, etc., etc. The third thing I learnt is that when we are thinking in terms of a past or tradition or a society's way of thinking, or something which you think is different and unique here, being represented in the lives of the people or myself, then we must realize that there is an apparent continuity, but behind it lies a whole world of interpretation. So what we have is never exactly the